Flashback. While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up. End of flashback. Soon after montage. Yesterday, meanwhile, back in the Lola. A few moments later, more moments later, later, in the void, much later, much later, much later, much later, the following Thursday, later that same evening. Just then, by sheer coincidence, 12 o'clock midnight, 3:28 a.m., 7:59 a.m., 8:01 p.m., 10 seconds later, 12 seconds later, 1 minute, 37 seconds later, 2 very boring minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 11 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later, 1 hour later, 1 hour later, 2 hours 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 later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 5 hours later, 346 minutes later, 6 hours later, 6 hours later, 6.5 hours later, 7 hours later, 8 hours later, 8 hours later, approximately 10 hours later, several song-filled hours later, many hours later,